Sometimes miracles don't shout. They whisper. In a dog's loyal eyes, a child's first brave word, or a father's long-awaited embrace, Sonny didn't just save lives. He healed hearts and reminded a broken family what home really means. Maybe that wasn't chance. Maybe it was grace. Because when we open our hearts to love, even in life's hardest moments, God still sends quiet miracles to remind us that hope is never lost. The autumn winds swept gently through Maple Glen, a quiet, picturesque town tucked against the rolling hills of northern Georgia. It was a town where time seemed to have slowed, where grand oaks stood as living monuments to forgotten stories. Their golden leaves danced across cobbled streets and gathered in soft piles beside the worn porches of century-old homes. The morning air was crisp with the scent of damp earth and the faint promise of rain. Clouds hung low gray and moody, casting a muted glow over the town. Just beyond the heart of Maple Glen, nestled at the edge of a narrow dirt road, stood Brooks Veterinary Clinic, a quaint, ivy-clad building with weathered white shutters and a green tin roof that creaked in the breeze. Inside, Dr. Helen Brooks moved with practiced grace through the quiet clinic. At 42, Helen had the kind of ageless beauty forged from resilience and compassion. Her chestnut brown hair was always pulled back into a loose, low bun, a few rebellious strands framing a face lined gently by years of both sorrow and joy. Her tall, slender frame often seemed lost in her oversized cream cardigan, and her deep hazel eyes carried the heavy warmth of someone who had once loved deeply and lost greatly. 15 years ago, a car accident had taken her only child and her marriage with it. Since then, her life became the clinic, and the broken creatures who crossed her threshold became the children she could no longer have. This morning, she wasn't expecting visitors, but as she sat by the reception desk sipping black coffee from a chipped porcelain mug, she heard a soft rustle outside the front door. Before she could rise, the clinic's door creaked open, and in walked a man with broad shoulders and a kind but weathered face. Tom Abernathy, a local farmer in his late 60s, known for his stoic demeanor and sun-tanned, calloused hands, stood just inside the entrance. His faded denim jacket hung loosely over a plaid shirt, and his old boots left faint prints on the wooden floor. But Helen barely registered Tom, because next to him was a magnificent golden retriever. The dog moved with a grace that belied his sturdy frame. His golden coat shimmered despite the faint drizzle, still clinging to the air outside, though bits of leaves and dirt clung stubbornly to his thick fur. His soulful brown eyes seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken. His name, as Tom introduced him, was Sonny, a 4-year-old therapy dog who had once served at the Maple Glen General Hospital, bringing comfort to patients and staff alike. Sonny had a habit of resting his broad head gently against those in distress, his calm presence often more healing than words. But since being retired from service, he had stayed with Tom on his quiet farm content until this very morning. He wouldn't leave her. Tom said, his voice low and rough like gravel. Helen's brows knit together as she followed Tom's gaze downward. Tucked between Sonny's strong front legs was a trembling bundle of white fur. A kitten, impossibly small, barely the size of Helen's hand, huddled close to Sonny's chest, its tiny body shivering despite the warmth pressed against it. Its fur was matted and dull, the pristine white marred by smudges of dirt and faint traces of dried blood. Helen crouched beside them. The kitten refused to lift its head or make eye contact. Even as Helen reached out, the tiny creature pressed itself deeper into Sonny's thick fur. Unusual behavior for a stray. Very unusual. Found them out by the old sugar mill road, Tom explained, his hands nervously adjusting his worn cap. Sonny's been howling since dawn. When I followed him, I found him like this. He wouldn't budge. Wouldn't even come for food. Helen's heart tightened. She reached gently beneath Sonny's protective embrace and lifted the kitten. Its frail body tensed, but it didn't struggle. That worried her more than if it had fought. As she cradled the kitten under the soft examination light, she saw faint bruising along its hind legs, subtle marks that told a story of rough handling, not the kind caused by an accident. No microchip, no collar. Just the faint scent of fear and something oddly familiar lavender, and smoke. Outside the clinic's fogged-up window, a silent figure sat beneath the towering oak tree across the road. Lila Monroe, a small girl of 8 with long, pale blonde hair tucked beneath a faded lilac hoodie, watched with wide, expressionless blue eyes. She was thin, almost too thin, her knees drawn up to her chest as she sat perfectly still. Lila had been a ghostly presence in Maple Glen ever since her mother died in a house fire 2 years prior. The trauma had stolen her voice. She hadn't spoken a word since that night. Her father, Sheriff Dale Monroe, a man worn thin by grief and guilt, had tried everything. But Lila remained locked in her silent world. Helen had noticed her visits before, always sitting by the old oak, always watching, but never approaching. And now, through the fogged window pane, Lila's eyes weren't on Helen or the adults inside the clinic. They were locked onto Sonny and the fragile kitten in his care. Inside, Sonny lay down on the examination room floor, his massive head resting beside the kitten's heated enclosure. His eyes never left the small ball of fur, even as Helen examined and cleaned the bruises. The kitten remained eerily silent through it all, only flinching when Helen's fingers brushed over the bruises near its hind legs. Tom stood back, arms crossed over his chest, his lined face tight with concern. "You ever seen anything like that, Doc? A dog refusing to leave a cat like that?" Helen shook her head. "Not like this. He's guarding her like she's his own." The kitten's tiny chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths. As Helen reached for her medical chart, her gaze drifted once more out the window to where Lila sat. This time their eyes met, only for a heartbeat. But in that fragile moment, Helen saw something stir in the girl's guarded expression. Recognition. As if she understood exactly why that kitten wouldn't let go of the warmth beside it. And in that moment, under the brooding gray skies of Maple Glen beneath the old oak tree, something unseen shifted. Helen didn't know it yet, but this strange morning would become the first thread in a tapestry of healing for a broken kitten, a lonely girl, and perhaps even for herself. The days in Maple Glen remained trapped beneath a thick ceiling of low clouds, their heavy bellies pregnant with rain that never seemed to fall. Outside Brooks Veterinary Clinic, the old oak tree stood as it had for over a century, its sprawling branches like tired arms reaching for something long lost, and beneath it, day after day, sat little Lila Monroe. Wrapped in her too small lilac hoodie, its sleeves frayed and stained from years of wear, she became part of the landscape, silent, unmoving, a porcelain figure in a world too loud. Her pale blonde hair hung uncombed across her shoulders, her delicate chin perched atop knees drawn tightly to her chest. She stared across the street at the clinic's large bay window, her wide, pale blue eyes glassy but always watching. And though Sheriff Dale Monroe, her father, passed by in his patrol car each morning, his eyes flickering with hesitation and regret, he never stopped. The distance between them had grown into a chasm neither seemed able to bridge. Inside the clinic, another vigil continued. Sonny, once the vibrant therapy golden retriever of Maple Glen General, now moved only when Milo needed him. The large dog's coat, though still thick and golden, had lost its playful shine. He barely ate, barely moved, his whole world reduced to the fragile life of the tiny white kitten in the heated enclosure. Milo, no larger than a pair of cupped hands, had become the silent center of Sonny's universe. When Helen allowed them time together, Sonny would gently nuzzle the kitten, his tongue carefully soothing the fading bruises along Milo's legs, as if his love alone could erase the pain. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that Helen discovered the threads. Cleaning the corner of Milo's bedding, her fingers caught on a bright red strand, thin and synthetic. She held it up against the light, her chest tightening at the familiar color. Carefully lifting Milo's tiny paw, she found another red fiber tangled in his claws. With trembling hands, she placed the fibers in a small evidence bag, her mind racing to the missing persons poster pinned at the post office. Matthew Carter, 7 years old, Missing 5 days now, last seen near Marrow Creek wearing a red wool sweater. The room seemed to close in around her, the faint scent of antiseptic and damp fur mingling with memories she had fought to forget. Her son Oliver had worn a red sweater on the day the accident took him away. She could still remember the way that vibrant color burned against the cold steel of the wrecked car, a cruel splash of life in a moment of devastating silence. Sonny pressed his warm head against her side, his deep brown eyes filled with a quiet, knowing sorrow. Helen knelt beside him, her fingers sinking into his thick fur as she fought the rising tide of grief. She hadn't allowed herself to remember this way in years. Outside, a new figure had appeared under the old oak. Margaret Whitlow, the county's senior social worker, stood like a storm cloud in human form. Tall and sharp-featured, she wore a black wool coat, buttoned all the way up her posture, rigid and unyielding. Her dark auburn hair was pinned into a tight bun, not a strand out of place. Her career had been built on order and efficiency, and her reputation for making difficult decisions without hesitation was as notorious as it was feared. Margaret crossed the street with the clipped precision of a woman who did not have time for second chances. The door to the clinic opened with a soft chime, and Helen met her at the counter, a weary calm settling over her features. Dr. Brooks Margaret began her tone as sharp and cold as the air outside. I've been informed that Lila Monroe has been spending her days here, alone, unsupervised. Helen folded her arms across her chest, her voice low but steady. She's not disturbing anyone. She sits quietly under the oak tree. That's all. Margaret's gray eyes narrowed. That kind of isolation is unhealthy. Sheriff Monroe has expressed concern. We're evaluating whether a placement in a special care facility might be necessary if this continues. Helen drew in a slow breath, fighting the urge to raise her voice. Instead, her words came out calm and deliberate. She doesn't need to be placed in a special care facility. She just needs someone to sit beside her under that tree and expect nothing in return but her presence. Margaret's expression didn't soften. If anything, she seemed almost annoyed by the simplicity of the suggestion. And who will take on that responsibility? Helen, you. If that's what it takes, Helen answered without hesitation. Margaret closed her planner with a soft snap and turned for the door. Be careful what you offer, she called back, her heels clicking crisply against the floor as she left the clinic and disappeared down the street. As twilight descended and the air grew colder, Helen stood by the window watching the girl who remained beneath the oak tree, her small shoulders shivering under the thin lilac fabric. Without a word, Helen pulled a thick plaid blanket from the supply closet, wrapped it over one arm, and stepped outside. The breeze tugged at the edges of the blanket as she crossed the quiet street. Lila didn't move when Helen knelt beside her, gently draping the warm fabric around her trembling frame. For a long, breathless moment, the girl remained still, her face hidden. Then slowly she lifted her head and looked at Helen with those wide, ocean-deep eyes. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Instead, she offered the faintest of nods, one small, fragile gesture of understanding. Helen sat down beside her, drawing her knees close, just as Lila did. The two sat in shared silence as the evening stars emerged from behind the gray veil above. Overhead, the old oak's brittle branches whispered secrets to the night air, and for the first time in many years, Helen felt the sharp edge of her grief soften into something bearable, a fragile hope taking root beneath the old oak tree. A thin veil of frost blanketed Maple Glen by morning, dusting rooftops and curling the edges of fallen leaves into brittle, silver-lined memories of autumn. Helen stood by the clinic's wide bay window, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Lila Monroe once again settle under the old oak tree. Wrapped in the thick plaid blanket Helen had given her the night before, the girl appeared more a fragile part of the landscape than a child meant to laugh and run. But today, something was different. Her posture was less closed off, and for the first time in days, her eyes lifted toward the door of the clinic, not just to look, but as if she were weighing the possibility of approaching. Inside, Sunny remained a constant guardian beside Milo's enclosure. The golden retriever, though weakened from days of refusing his full meals, stayed close, his soft brown eyes following every tiny movement the kitten made. Milo, still a delicate wisp of white fur and thin bones, had begun to move more freely. Though his steps were unsteady, he no longer cowered in the corner. It was as if Sunny's unwavering presence had breathed a quiet courage into his tiny frame. Helen turned away from the window when she heard the soft jingle of the clinic door. Her heart lifted briefly before she realized it wasn't Lila. Instead, it was Sheriff Dale Monroe. He entered with the measured, deliberate steps of a man who spent his life controlling chaos, but had utterly failed to bring peace to his own home. Dale was in his mid-40s, his once broad shoulders now slightly stooped under the invisible weight of guilt. His dark brown uniform seemed too heavy for his tall, lean frame, and a permanent shadow of unshaven stubble darkened his jawline. His eyes, gray like the skies that hovered over Maple Glen, held a tiredness that no amount of sleep could mend. He removed his wide-brimmed hat and nodded to Helen, his voice low and rough. "Morning, Doc. Got your call." Helen gestured toward the back room. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." Inside the exam room, Helen carefully retrieved the evidence bag containing the red fibers found tangled in Milo's claws. She placed it on the table next to a printed photo of Matthew Carter, the missing boy from Marrow Creek. Dale studied both items in silence, his thick brows drawing together as his hand clenched involuntarily at his side. "That's the same color as the sweater," he muttered, his voice a rasp against the stillness of the room. Helen nodded, her tone equally quiet. "And there's more. Milo's been showing signs of trauma, bruising around his legs, and a general aversion to human contact. But yesterday, Lila sat closer to the window. And today, she's closer still." Dale swallowed hard. "She hasn't spoken a word since the fire." He admitted, his voice cracking under the admission. "Not one word. But you think she knows something?" Before Helen could answer, a soft tapping sound drew their attention to the exam room door. Lila stood there, her small fingers curled around the doorframe, her blue eyes huge in her pale face. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. And despite the blanket around her shoulders, she shivered. Helen crouched to her level, her voice as soft as the falling frost outside. "Would you like to come to see Milo for a moment?" Lila hesitated, then slowly she crossed the threshold, her eyes flicking to her father and then quickly away. She stepped toward the enclosure where Sunny lay curled protectively around the kitten. Milo, sensing her nearness, lifted his small head. In a moment that seemed to pull time itself to a halt, Lila knelt before the glass and placed her small pale hand against it. Sunny lifted his head and with a soft, welcoming whine stood up. To everyone's surprise, Milo took a few wobbly steps toward the glass, his tiny nose pressed to the spot where Lila's hand rested. Helen saw it immediately, the way the girl's shoulders relaxed, how her eyes softened just a bit. Without a word, Lila turned, pulled a small scrap of paper from the pocket of her hoodie, and set it on the examination table. Her hands fumbled briefly before she found a pencil nearby. With careful, deliberate strokes, she wrote a single word on the paper. Then she slid it toward Helen and stepped back, her face turned toward the enclosure once again. Helen looked down at the paper. In uneven, shaky letters, Lila had written, "Toast." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dale cleared his throat, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Is that the kitten's name?" Lila gave the faintest nod, her fingers tightening around the blanket at her chest. Helen crouched to meet her gaze. "Lila did. Matthew named him Toast?" she asked gently. Lila blinked once, and then almost imperceptibly shook her head. She pointed to herself. Helen's heart clenched. The girl had named the kitten. She knew something had seen something, but the trauma that held her voice captive would not release the words so easily. Tension hung in the air until the door chime rang again. This time it was Deputy Eric Maddox, a wiry man in his late 30s with close-cropped sandy hair and an always-present look of concern etched into his narrow face. He stepped inside, his breath fogging slightly in the cold air. "Sheriff," he said quickly, "we found fresh tracks by Marrow Creek near the old mill. Children's footprints and what looks like animal tracks. Could be recent. Thought you'd want to know?" Dale turned to Lila, his voice as soft as Helen's had been. "Sweetheart, did you see Matthew near the creek?" Lila bit her lower lip, her eyes shining with unspoken thoughts. Slowly, she reached into her hoodie again and produced a small strip of bright orange fleece. Her small hands trembled as she handed it to her father. Dale took it reverently, recognizing the fabric immediately. It was a strip torn from the missing boy's distinctive red sweater. Helen's breath caught. This was no longer just a theory. There was hope, fragile and flickering, but hope all the same. Outside, the wind rose through the empty streets, scattering brittle leaves across the pavement, and beneath the old oak tree, a child's silent voice had just begun to break through the long, dark silence. The winter wind swept through Maple Glen with a sharp bite, scouring the streets clean of warmth. Helen Brooks stood outside the clinic, watching Sonny pace along the sidewalk, his movements restless and charged with purpose. Over the past days, the golden retriever had grown increasingly unsettled, his instincts pulling him toward something unseen. And now his direction was certain. Without hesitation, Sonny turned toward the town's outskirts, toward the long-abandoned service station and the old granary that loomed nearby. Helen threw on her coat and followed. The granary stood like a forgotten relic, battered by years of neglect. Its faded siding peeled back like curling pages from an old book, and broken window frames gaped open to the cold. Sonny pressed ahead, his nose to the ground, tracing a path toward a collapsed section of wall near the side entrance. Helen crouched beside him, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Their small footprints pressed faintly into the frost-dusted earth, child-sized. Next to them, the delicate paw prints of a kitten. Sonny whined and stepped closer to the opening, his ears flattened and tail held stiff. Helen aimed her flashlight into the dark recess beyond the broken wall. The beam swept across cracked concrete and tumbled debris, then caught something pale against the jagged wood, a single strand of golden hair caught, as if left behind deliberately. Helen's heart quickened. She retrieved a small evidence bag from her coat pocket and carefully secured the fragile strand. A soft rustle echoed deeper inside the granary. Sonny stood still, his gaze fixed on a narrow passage beneath the collapsed interior. Helen leaned closer, but before she could investigate, footsteps approached from behind. Sheriff Dale Monroe appeared at the entrance, his face lined with exhaustion. He held his hat in his hands, his breath clouding the air. "Doc," he said, voice rough, "she's gone. Lila's missing. She wasn't at the oak tree this morning. Hasn't been home either." Helen felt her chest tighten. She swept her flashlight beam once more into the darkness. "She's here," she whispered. As if summoned by the thought, a small form appeared in the shadows. Lila emerged slowly from beneath the wreckage, her face pale dirt smudging her cheeks. Wrapped in the plaid blanket Helen had given her, she clutched a piece of torn cardboard tightly in her hands. Without a word, she approached Helen and her father. She held up the cardboard. Written in uneven, trembling letters was a message, "He's alive." Dale fell to his knees, his hand reaching out tentatively. Lila didn't step back this time. Slowly, she placed her tiny hand into his. Helen felt a swell of emotion rise in her throat. Whatever Lila had seen or heard in the darkness, she believed with every fragile part of her that Matthew Carter was still out there. And now, for the first time, she was letting someone in on her silent truth. That night, after the search parties set out into the frozen night, Helen returned to her small office at the back of the clinic. She sat at her old writing desk, a journal before her that had remained unopened for years. Its pages were yellowed, filled with letters never sent to her lost son, Oliver. With a trembling hand, she turned to a fresh page and began to write. "Dear Oliver, Today I saw something I thought I'd never witness again, a child finding her way back from the darkness. And through her courage, a father found his daughter's hand again. I think I'm ready to be more than a witness to this life. I think I'm ready to love again. Across the room, Milo slept curled against Sunny's side. Outside, the wind stirred gently through the bare limbs of the old oak tree, whispering a quiet promise of hope. The storm had raged for hours, hammering against the rooftops of Maple Glen with a fury the town hadn't seen in years. Rain slashed through the night like a relentless curtain of silver, and the swollen creeks threatened to spill over their banks. Inside the small, dimly lit veterinary clinic, the storm's howling winds sounded like the cries of something long forgotten. Helen Brooks sat by the window, her journal open but untouched. Each page bore her thoughts to Oliver, her lost son. Yet tonight her pen remained still. Her mind circled back to Lila, to the quiet desperation in the girl's eyes, and to the message she had scrawled, "He's alive." The clock had just struck midnight when a sharp, urgent bark shattered the restless quiet. Helen's head snapped up. Sonny stood by the front door, his body tense, his ears flat against his skull. His deep, throaty barks were unlike any Helen had heard from him before, filled with urgency, almost desperation. He tugged at the edge of her coat with his teeth, his strong neck muscles flexing as he tried to pull her toward the door. Helen grabbed her raincoat and flashlight. The air outside was thick with the scent of wet earth and flooded streets. Sonny shot ahead, his powerful legs splashing through shallow puddles as he led her toward the abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, the storm had weakened just enough for her flashlight to cut through the lingering mist. The gas station stood hollow and broken, the boarded-up windows rattling in the cold wind. Helen noticed something she hadn't seen before. Part of the brick wall near the foundation had crumbled away, likely washed loose by the torrential rains. A dark opening yawned at the base of the wall, a hidden crevice now revealed. Sonny stood near it, his body pressed low to the ground, his tail still, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. He let out a low whine, his head tilting slightly as if listening for something beneath the storm's fading growl. Just then, headlights cut through the night. Sheriff Dale Monroe's truck skidded to a stop nearby, and he leapt out, his boots crunching over gravel as he approached. Behind him, Deputy Eric Maddox and a small search team followed, their flashlights flickering through the darkness. Dale was soaked to the bone, his uniform clinging to his frame. His face was drawn tight with fear and exhaustion. "Helen, what is it?" She pointed toward the newly exposed opening. "He's in there. Sonny led me straight here." Without hesitation, Dale crouched near the hole and called out, his voice raw with hope and dread. "Ethan, can you hear me, son?" A faint sound echoed back, barely audible over the dying storm. Helen's heart caught in her throat. Dale didn't wait. He grabbed a crowbar from the back of his truck and began prying at the remaining bricks, his hands slick and trembling. The deputies joined in, and within moments the gap widened enough for a grown man to squeeze through. "Stay here," Dale ordered, but Helen shook her head. "I'm going," she said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. They crawled into the darkness together. The air inside was damp and cold, filled with the pungent smell of mildew and decay. Flashlight beams cut through the oppressive blackness, and then Helen saw it tucked into a hollow space behind a crumbling support beam. Ethan Carter. The boy lay curled in a tight ball, his face, pale lips cracked and blue from the cold. His small arms were wrapped protectively around Milo, the tiny kitten nestled against his chest, and beside him, keeping him warm, was Sonny. The golden retriever's thick body curled around the boy's fragile form, his head resting gently across Ethan's legs, his eyes meeting Helen's with silent urgency. Helen crawled forward, her voice soft but commanding. "Ethan, sweetheart, it's okay. You're safe now." The boy didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his eyelids barely fluttering. Helen's hands moved quickly, checking for signs of hypothermia and shock. His skin was ice cold, but his pulse weak as it was still beat beneath her fingertips. Dale reached out with trembling hands. "We've got you, buddy. You're going to be okay." With practiced care, Helen helped lift the boy into Dale's arms. Milo mewed weakly and nestled against Ethan's chest, refusing to be parted. Sonny stood slowly, his body stiff from hours spent shielding the boy from the cold. He nuzzled Ethan's cheek once before following closely behind. The search team cleared the exit as Helen and Dale emerged from the darkness, with Ethan cradled between them. Emergency responders moved swiftly, wrapping the boy in thermal blankets and preparing him for transport to the hospital. As the ambulance pulled away, Helen stood in the rain watching until its lights disappeared into the distance. Sonny sat beside her, his head leaning heavily against her thigh. For the first time in weeks, Helen allowed herself a breath of relief. That night back at the clinic, with the rain finally fading into silence, Helen sat at her desk once more. Her journal lay open beneath her tired hands. This time the words came easily. "Dear Oliver, tonight, we found a boy lost in the darkness, and with him a tiny life he refused to abandon. There's something about that kind of loyalty, that quiet courage in the face of despair that reminds me of you. Perhaps love doesn't always have to be loud or grand. Sometimes it's just a child and a kitten in the dark waiting for someone to find them. And when we do, maybe that's all the miracle we really need." Outside, the streets of Maple Glen lay silent under the soft patter of the last fading raindrops, and for the first time in what felt like years, the dawn seemed to promise more than just another day. It promised hope. The faint light of dawn pushed through the rain-slicked windows of Maple Glen General Hospital. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted away, leaving behind streets washed clean by the night's relentless downpour. In room 204, the air was thick with quiet anticipation. Machines beeped steadily beside the hospital bed, their rhythmic sounds the only confirmation that life still pulsed within the small, fragile body, resting there. Helen Brooks stood near the door, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her tired eyes watched Ethan Carter pale and still beneath crisp white sheets. His dark hair clung to his forehead in damp curls, and his tiny hands clutched the corner of the blanket as if holding onto a fragile thread of security. Beside him, Milo lay curled at his side, the kitten's small chest rising and falling, in sync with the boy's shallow breaths. Sonny sat by the window, his golden coat catching the first rays of light. His deep brown eyes never left the boy's face. Helen had never seen the retriever so still, so perfectly focused. It was as if the world itself had quieted, waiting for a miracle. Then, without warning, Ethan's eyelids fluttered. His lips parted, cracked and dry, and the faintest sound emerged, a single word, breathless and fragile, but unmistakably clear. "Sonny." The room seemed to exhale all at once. Dale Monroe stood frozen by the bedside, his rough hands clenched tightly at his sides. His uniform jacket hung loosely from his shoulders, soaked from the night before, and now stained with the remnants of old fears. His face, worn from years of worry and silence, softened in a way Helen hadn't thought possible. Ethan Dale stepped closer, his voice low, careful not to startle the boy. "Can you hear me?" Son Ethan's gaze drifted toward him, unfocused at first, but then his small, shaking fingers reached out toward the golden retriever. Sonny rose instantly, moving to the side of the bed, pressing his warm nose against the boy's palm. Ethan's chapped lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Helen blinked back the sudden burn of tears as the moment settled in. Ethan's voice came again, hoarse, but growing stronger. "Sonny, stayed? Warm?" Dale swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You're safe now, Ethan," he whispered. "Tell us what happened, son." The boy's small chest rose and fell with each shallow breath as he gathered the strength to speak. "Man, bad man. Pulled me, said no noise." His voice faltered, and his eyes squeezed shut for a moment before he continued. "I ran, found Milo, hid in the dark, kept warm." Helen crouched beside the bed, her hand gently brushing Ethan's forehead. "You were so brave," she whispered. "And Sonny, he found you." Outside the door, a small shadow shifted. Lila stood quietly in the hallway, her wide blue eyes peering in through the narrow glass window. Her blonde hair was damp, clinging to her small, delicate face. She held a folded piece of paper tightly in her hands, her knuckles white from the grip. Helen noticed her and crossed the room, opening the door with a gentle creak. "Lila," she said softly, crouching to meet the girl's gaze. "Do you want to come say hello?" Lila hesitated, her bare feet shuffling against the cool hospital tiles. But then slowly, she stepped into the room. Her eyes never left Ethan's face. She stood at the foot of the bed, her small body trembling under the oversized sweater she wore. Dale turned, his eyes widening slightly. "Layla." His voice cracked on her name, as if speaking it after so long felt foreign. Lila's gaze flicked between her father and the boy on the bed. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time in years, sound broke free. "Hi," she whispered the single word, delicate as spun glass. Dale staggered back, his knees nearly buckling as he reached for the edge of the bed to steady himself. His weathered face, crumpled tears welling up in his eyes faster than he could stop them. He crossed the room in 2 strides and dropped to his knees before his daughter. "Hi," she repeated, her voice a little stronger this time. Dale reached out his large, calloused hands, gently cupping her face. For the first time in years, father and daughter were no longer separated by a wall of silence. His tears fell freely as he pulled her into his arms, his voice breaking apart with every whispered, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Helen turned away, her own emotions, a fragile storm just beneath the surface. Sonny sat beside the bed, his tail thumping softly against the floor. His eyes moved between the children as if satisfied that his silent work was finally done. In that small hospital room, the weight of years of silence and pain began to lift, replaced by the quiet beginnings of healing. 2 children once lost and afraid found their voices in the presence of a loyal friend. And through that simple bond, a father found his daughter again. Spring crept gently into Maple Glen, brushing the bare branches with the softest hints of green. The air still held the chill of winter, but the days were longer now, and with every sunrise, the promise of new beginnings hung a little heavier in the sky. In the small white house on the edge of town, one that had long felt too empty, warm light poured from its windows as laughter echoed softly through the rooms. Inside, Lila sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her blonde hair falling in soft waves around her small shoulders. A spark had returned to her wide blue eyes, the haunted silence that once held her captive, now replaced by cautious curiosity. Across from her, Ethan Carter sat with his legs tucked beneath him, his pale cheeks slowly regaining their healthy color. His dark eyes watched every move Lila made as she arranged a circle of smooth river stones on the floor. At the center of the circle, Sonny lay stretched out, his golden fur a warm cushion beneath Milo, who purred contentedly against his chest. Milo had grown stronger in the weeks since his rescue, but he still refused to eat unless Sonny was near. Helen had tried every trick in the book, special feeds, warm milk, even hand feeding, but nothing soothed the kitten, except the steady presence of the golden retriever. Helen stood in the doorway, arms crossed loosely, watching the 2 children interact. Her heart ached with a warmth she had almost forgotten. Dressed in a soft cream sweater and worn jeans, she looked every bit the mother she had once dreamed of becoming. Her dark auburn hair was tied back, and though the years of loss still marked her delicate features, there was light in her expression again, a quiet, hopeful kind. Sonny lifted his head at the sound of footsteps approaching the house. A deep, familiar bark rumbled in his throat before the door creaked open and Sheriff Dale Monroe stepped hesitantly inside. His tall frame filled the entrance, his uniform traded for a plaid shirt and worn jeans that made him look more like a farmer than the town's most respected lawman. His hands worked nervously at the hem of his shirt, his dark hair a little more unruly than usual, and his tired eyes scanned the room before landing on Lila. For a moment he simply stood there, his throat working against words too long left unsaid. Then Lila stood too, her small frame straight and steady as she crossed the room toward him. "Hi," she said, her voice soft but sure. Dale knelt slowly, his knees creaking with age and years of unspoken regret. "Hi, sweetheart," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. His large, calloused hands reached out tentatively, and this time Lila stepped directly into his embrace. His arms wrapped around her with a gentleness that belied their strength, his eyes closing as his heart broke open and mended all at once. From across the room, Helen watched them, her heart both heavy and light. She took a quiet breath and turned toward the kitchen, giving father and daughter the space they needed. Her steps felt lighter than they had in years. Today was the day she would make it official. Today she would become Lila's mother, not just in her heart, but on paper in the eyes of the law, and in every way that truly mattered. In the following days, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost like a dream. Sonny became the quiet guardian of their newfound family, always present, always watching. Milo grew stronger, but remained as attached to the golden retriever as ever. Whenever Sonny moved, Milo followed. Whenever Sonny rested, Milo curled into his side, purring louder than the softest rain. The news from the sheriff's office came quietly but decisively, thanks to Ethan's brave testimony and the subtle details. He remembered the scuffed boots, the frayed cuff of a jacket sleeve, the lingering smell of gasoline the police were able to identify and arrest the man responsible for his abduction. A drifter named Carl Briggs, a man with a long history of petty crimes and a face that no longer haunted the town's streets. One evening, Dale came by with an old guitar slung over his shoulder. His wife's guitar, the one he hadn't touched since the day she passed. He settled onto the porch steps while Lila and Ethan sat nearby, their heads resting against each other's shoulders, watching as the twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold. With fingers that trembled at first, but grew steadier with each note, Dale played a soft tune his wife used to sing to Lila when she was just a baby. The melody drifted across the yard, mingling with the scent of fresh grass and the faint rustle of the oak tree's budding leaves. Sonny lay on the porch beside the children, Milo tucked beneath his chin. And in that perfect moment, Helen knew this was home. Not the house, not the town, but the people and the quiet love that filled the spaces between them. She stood on the threshold, smiling through tears she no longer feared. For the first time in a long while, everything felt exactly as it should be. Maple Glen awakened to a gentle autumn morning, the air laced with the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the sweet promise of the harvest festival. Golden light filtered through the sprawling branches of the old oak in the town square, casting dappled shadows over the cobblestone paths. Colorful bunting fluttered between the lampposts, and the air buzzed softly with the warmth of gathered hearts. Helen Brooks stood near the stage set at the center of the square, her hand smoothing the front of her soft blue dress. The years of quiet sorrow etched into her delicate features seemed lighter today, her green eyes reflecting hope rather than grief. Nearby, Dale Monroe stood with his arms crossed, his usual stoic presence softened by the small girl at his side. Lila clutched his hand, her slender frame wrapped in a pale yellow cardigan that danced slightly in the cool breeze. Her golden hair was neatly combed, pinned to one side, with a delicate white ribbon that caught the morning sun. Sonny lay at the foot of the stage, his thick golden fur shining brilliantly under the early light. Milo, now a healthy ball of mischief and soft white fluff, nestled comfortably against his broad chest. The unlikely pair had become a symbol in the town, one of healing hope and the simple extraordinary power of quiet companionship. The townspeople gathered in clusters, their faces bright with expectation. Children ran through the crowd with tiny paper flags, and the scent of cinnamon apples and fresh-baked bread filled the air. It wasn't just the festival that drew them here today. It was the story that had bound every heart in Maple Glen, a story of resilience and love. Helen watched as Mayor June Whitaker, a petite woman in her 60s with tightly curled silver hair and a voice that could command silence over a roaring crowd, took to the small podium. Her cheeks were rosy from the brisk air, and her eyes shone as she addressed the gathered townsfolk. Today she began, her voice ringing clear across the square. We celebrate not only the bounty of our harvest, but the strength and courage that brought our community together. There are many heroes among us, but sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truths. She turned her gaze toward Lila, who stood frozen beside Dale. Helen stepped closer, kneeling gently beside her. "You're ready, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair from Lila's face. "Just one sentence, that's all. And remember, everyone here loves you." Lila's small hands trembled as she approached the podium. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. Her eyes darted toward Ethan, standing near the front with his parents who had recently returned to Maple Glen after making the decision to stay and rebuild their lives. His face lit up with an encouraging smile. Sonny rose to his feet, padding silently across the stage. He sat beside Lila, his warm body pressed against her leg. She reached down instinctively, her fingers tangling gently in his soft fur. And in that moment, her courage found its voice. She stepped up to the microphone, her lips parting, her voice soft but clear enough for every heart to hear. "Sonny saved us all," she said. A hush settled for a heartbeat before the entire square erupted in applause cheers, rising like a wave through the golden light. Tears filled the eyes of mothers and fathers, children clapped with wild abandon, and Dale Monroe fell to his knees beside his daughter, pulling her into his arms with a raw, unspoken gratitude that left him speechless. Helen stood nearby, her hand pressed to her heart as the final adoption papers tucked into her bag seemed to weigh less than a feather. Today, it was official. Lila was hers. Not just by law, but by love. As the celebration continued, music filled the square, fiddles and soft guitar blending into a tune that drifted through the autumn air. Tables of food lined the edges of the square, laughter echoed under the old oak tree, and children danced in the warm light that filtered through its branches. Dale joined Helen beneath the oak, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder as they watched the children play. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Helen smiled through her tears. "We found our way back, Dale. All of us." In the soft grass beneath the towering oak, Sonny and Milo lay side by side, surrounded by the peaceful hum of music and joy. Milo stretched his tiny white paws across Sonny's thick fur, his purring audible even above the faint strains of the fiddle. And above them, the golden light pierced through the branches of the old oak, where long ago a frightened girl found her voice, a boy found his way home, and a town remembered how to hope again. Sometimes it's not grand gestures that change lives, it's small acts of love done quietly and faithfully. Like Sonny lying beside Ethan through the coldest night, or a little girl finding her voice when everyone had given up hope. In the rush of our busy lives, we often forget that just being there for someone, listening, caring, staying close, can be the greatest miracle of all. So today, take a moment. Sit with someone in silence, offer a kind word, or simply smile at a stranger. You never know whose life you might touch. If this story warmed your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more stories of love and redemption, and comment below. Who is the Sonny in your life, the one who stayed when things were hardest? We'd love to hear your story.